So thank you all for having me and for coming today. So I was asked to talk about my Alaska work, so I'm not going to talk about Hawaii today or frogs. The title of my talk is Timing is Everything. How does changing phenology influence coastal Alaska wetlands? And before I start, I'd like to thank the people that have been working with me on this project for the last 5 years. So I've been working with Josh Leffler, who's a professor at South Dakota State University. My graduate students, Ryan Choi and Lindsay Carlson. We've had a postdoctoral researcher, Kathy Kelsey, involved. And we've had a USGS Alaska Science Center collaborator, Joel Schmutz. He's our bird guy. And then my other PI at University of Alaska Anchorage. So this has been very much a collaborative effort. We've all been involved in writing the papers that I'm going to present today, and we were involved in the NSF grant that funded this research. So you guys are all ecologists, you're all scientists. I'm sure you're well aware of climate change, so I probably don't have to go over that too much. And I just read in the news yesterday that we've hit 415 parts per million for CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's the most CO2 in the atmosphere in all of human history. Yay, humans. So anyway, climate change is happening, and one thing of note that's relevant for my research is that it's happening at a faster rate towards the poles, about 2 to 3 times faster. And over the last 100 years, we've seen 3 to 5 degree temperature increases towards the poles. Okay, I'm going to get that down, I promise. Not yet, not yet. Uh-oh. Okay. No. Okay. All right. So, so one of the main ways that we're measuring the impacts of climate change in terms of biological resources is we're seeing earlier phenologies. And so what does this mean? Phenology just means the timing of biological events. So things like when trees first bud in the spring, when birds start calling, when they start nesting. So I'm sure you guys have all seen these things, and they're easy to record. It's also just a very sensitive barometer to climate change. So it's something that we're starting to see with taxa around the world. There's been an exponential number of research articles in the last 20 years or so focused on phenological changes as a result of climate change. So some of the early reviews, like the one by Parmesan, highlighted this response. But there's been a lot more recent reviews done looking at summarizing phenological responses around the world. And some of these reviews now are getting more into the details of what we're seeing. And they're doing things like identifying what exactly is it that animals and plants are responding to with climate change. Most of that research focuses on temperature, or highlights temperature as being the main variable that species are responding to. Towards the equator, we're seeing that precipitation and seasonality is also a major player. So what, I guess that's not going to work. Okay, so, so the main thing we're really seeing is earlier springs. And so this is particularly happening towards the poles because we're seeing those higher temperature changes there. And here I just wanted to highlight some really long-term data sets to convince you, in case you needed any convincing, that we're seeing earlier springs in these regions. On the left side, this is a data set from a town called Nenana, which is in Alaska. And for the last 100 years, they've been recording in that town when the river breaks up. And river breakup in Alaska is really important because they wait for the river to break because that allows them to travel for the summer and also to collect salmon and other fish and resources that they need. So this town has this really long-term data set because they've been monitoring this river breakup and when it happens. The other thing they've been doing is they've started fundraising with placing bets on when the river's going to break every year. And so if you guys are betting individuals, you might want to bet on earlier springs happening because that seems to be the trajectory in the data set. So this was just last month. They had the earliest river break that they've had in the last 100 years. So it's almost increased by a month the river broke on April 14th. And the person that had placed the bet with that date and time won $300,000. So it's a good way to make money, to bet on earlier springs in the Arctic. On the right side, this is the spring green up at our site. So I'll come back to this data set, but we've been monitoring green up at our site as well. And there's always a lot of interannual variability in this data, but as you can see, there's a consistent trend towards earlier springs. And we're starting to see spring advance by about 2.6 days per decade. So another thing that's coming out of these reviews on phenology changes with climate change is that they're starting to see that there's taxonomic differences. So some species are much more responsive to temperature changes than others. And something that's kind of, I think, interesting that's coming out of this is that we're seeing invertebrates and ectotherms are much more responsive to changes in temperature and really changing their phenology at a much greater rate than endotherms are. And they're also seeing trends in this data by body size. So smaller organisms are much more responsive than larger organisms. And you can start thinking about what the repercussions of that might be. But I think that's really interesting. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. Okay, another thing that's changing is, and we maybe don't think about it quite as much, is the phenology of migration. And so the reason that this might be of concern, particularly long migrations like those that some birds do, is that the rate of warming is happening much faster in those higher latitudes, right, than the lower latitudes. And so species that have to migrate really far are getting kind of maybe different cues about when they should migrate in the southern latitudes than they would if they were in the northern latitudes. And so, so they might not be arriving at their breeding ranges at the right time. And so this is something that, maybe the species, when they start migrating, they're like, oh, hey, it seems like spring happened a little earlier than I thought it did when I was leaving my wintering range. Maybe I should speed up. For a lot of birds, it's not so easy to do this because they have a lot of stopovers along the way and they really need to recoup their resources. And so they have to spend quite a bit of time eating and getting ready to fly further. So they can't often hasten their timing, even if they know that they're arriving a little bit late. So this has resulted in what people call phenological mismatch. So I'm going to use the term phenological mismatch or trophic mismatch or just asynchrony in timing. Those are kind of used interchangeably in the literature. But the idea is that some of these migratory species, for example, have probably evolved to maximize resources when they get to the breeding range. So the thought is that they usually time their migration so that when they arrive, they have really high quality forage. And so with climate change, we think, because they're getting maybe the wrong signals in the lower latitudes about when to start migrating, that spring has already kind of started happening up north, and by the time they get up there, the resources are not as high quality as they would have been had they arrived on time. And so the springs kind of are starting earlier up north, and now they're not matching that high quality resources with what they would prefer. For some species like these migratory geese that we look at, it's thought that they evolved to arrive to maximize resources with hatch, because that's when they really need high quality resources around. So the big picture consequence of this might be that we see population declines in these migratory species. And that's why people have been really concerned with this concept of phenological mismatch. And there's been a lot of papers that have come out that have shown that, that species that aren't migrating on time, they're arriving in their breeding grounds too late, are showing declines. Or those that aren't quite as responsive to temperature changes are also showing declines. People have mostly shown this with migratory birds, but there's also been some research on caribou in the Arctic that have shown the same thing. Okay, so just to kind of review, the idea is that with climate change, we're seeing that there's a timing of season change. and that plants are potentially starting to grow earlier. And we're also seeing that climate change might be influencing the timing of migration such that they're not arriving on time to get high quality forage that they need. And a lot of the trophic mismatch literature has focused on how that consumer is influenced by this potential trophic mismatch. So people look at things like population size or gosling growth rate or the reproductive success of the consumer. But you guys all know that there's two species involved in this interaction, and it might not just be the consumer that's impacted. The producer also could be impacted, but people haven't really looked at that. And especially in Arctic systems where the consumer or the herbivores are often play a really strong role in structuring the plant communities in the system, we might need to consider the fact that these are herbivores, and when they arrive also might influence the producers in these systems. So we kind of argue in our research that we need to expand our view of what the impacts of these trophic mismatches might be, and we also need to be measuring some of the producer traits in response to trophic mismatch. So that's one thing I want you to think about. There have been some studies focused on the lower trophic level, and these studies are mostly looking at plant pollinator trophic mismatches. So the idea is that if plants start growing early, but for some reason pollinators don't arrive on time, plants might not get pollinated. They might have a lower seed set, and that might have long-term implications for plants. Most of the work looking at plant pollinator asynchronies have found that they don't seem to be developing very much. There's very few really good examples of that actually happening. And one of the reasons people think that's the case is, as I showed earlier, invertebrates are very responsive to temperature change, if not even more responsive than plants. So it seems like pollinators are really keeping up with climate change. And also a lot of pollinator food webs have a lot of other, it's not just a specialist relationship, there's a lot of other potential pollinators out there. So if one pollinator doesn't kick in, there's like a whole network of pollinators that could kick in. And yeah, so anyway, people don't think that this is that happening that much. But what we haven't seen in the literature is a lot of studies investigating phenological mismatch between plants and herbivores. And so that's something that we wanted to look at and how that might influence plant traits. People have really only done this looking at forage quality responses and again to look at how it affects the consumer. Okay, so I just kind of talked about this, and we often look at these consumer trait responses, but hey, we should also look at the producer traits. But there's other ways that this could be more complicated. So most phenological mismatch studies are focused on simple two-species interactions, like a goose and the plants. But as ecologists, I'm sure you all know, there's probably other species involved or are impacted by these relationships. So one thing that we need to start doing with these studies is looking more at other community response changes. So just as an example of that, there's a paper that just came out last year in PNAS looking at grizzly bears on Kodiak Island. And grizzly bears used to historically eat salmon early in the season, and then they would shift to elderberries. But elderberry phenology is changing, and elderberries are starting to be produced much earlier in the season. And grizzly bears actually like consuming elderberry more than they like consuming salmon. Who knew? And so they're switching now, and they're not eating the salmon anymore, and they're just eating elderberry early in the season. And so as you think about that, you can think about lots of situations where there'd be multiple species involved in these kind of phenologies changes. Not to mention that there's probably lots of other species in the system that are changing in terms of phenology. Okay, but then the other part that I want you to think about is that people haven't really looked at is what are the biogeochemical responses of these phenological mismatches? And that's what we really wanted to focus on in our study. People haven't really looked at how phenological mismatch is going to influence carbon and nitrogen cycling in the system. And we know that there's potential implications of this. And so we wanted to kind of expand this simple two-species interaction to looking at, like, what are the whole system consequences. Now, we are not the first people to think of this. In fact, Thackeray, back in 2010, almost 10 years ago now, he wrote this review article in Global Change Biology summarizing phenological mismatch across a bunch of systems. And he had a sentence in his paper where he said, although the precise consequences of phenological changes on ecosystem functioning are not clear, such disruption could have catastrophic environmental consequences and affect delivery of important ecosystem services. So his paper wasn't about the ecosystem consequences, but he really highlighted that this is an important implication of these changing phenologies and something that we need to start looking at. And then just last year, there was a paper in PNAS that, again, was looking at phenological mismatches, a review article. And towards the end of her paper, she wrote, the next challenges are to improve our ability to predict the direction of phenological change and understand the full consequences for communities and ecosystems. So again, kind of highlighting the idea that we haven't really expanded these studies beyond these simple two-species interactions. We need to look at community responses, but also ecosystem responses. She doesn't say how to do that, but just that it needs to be done. And then just this year, there was a review article in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution by Visser and Guynap. And their paper was about evolutionary and demographic consequences of mismatch. But at the end of their paper, they had these like future directions that need to, where research needs to go. And their number 4 was we need to look at community ecological effects and ecosystem consequences. And I could show a lot more examples of this. There's all these review articles about phenological mismatch. Almost all of them mention ecosystem function or services somewhere in their abstract or towards the end of their discussion, but it's never the focus of the paper. So this is something that we need to start looking at, and that's what we did. So our research was done in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. So this is a national wildlife refuge in Alaska, and it is actually as big as that square is on that map. So it's a very large area. And just to put it in perspective, it's about the size of the state of Oregon or about 1/3 the size of Spain. It's a huge national wildlife refuge, and that's what it looks like. It's like a river system with lots of lakes and ponds and very low stature vegetation, and as you move inland, it's a little bit more tundra. So our research was conducted very close to the Bering Sea near the Trophic River. And I'll just show you a couple more pictures of our site. So we conducted our research along the river that's very, very close to the Bering Sea. And what we stayed in and lived in were these weather ports for the season. So we'd put out these weather ports every year. We'd bring everything in each spring by snowmobile before snowmelt. We'd set up our weather ports, and there was no running water, no electricity. I'm just kind of trying to paint a picture of how hard it was to collect this data so that you really appreciate it. And so all the food that they needed for the year was brought in by snowmobile in the spring and kept in these weather ports. They slept in there a little bit. They mostly slept in tents all summer. So yeah, they didn't bathe, And all the fresh water that they had was from snowmelt. So they would just boil up snowmelt water, and that was what they drank all summer. And so sometimes they were out there for 4 or 5 months almost collecting the data. So it's pretty tough, but also kind of fun field conditions. So our research was focused on the interaction between Pacific blackbrant and a sedge species called Carex subspathicea. And Pacific brant are they're migratory geese, and they come from about Baja California up to our site every summer to breed. And when they get up there, they are very dependent on having this particular sedge species to forage on. They're colonial breeders at our site. So there's 4 goose species in our area, but they have the highest densities because one of their colonies is right there. There's about 500 nests per kilometer squared. And when they forage on this grazing lawn or on this sedge, they form what's called grazing lawn. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the grazing lawn concept, but they're called grazing lawns because they look like golf putting greens. And when the geese forage on them, they reduce them to really low stature, and they're kind of really bright green and high in nutrient quality. So it's pretty much a monoculture that they eat on. And this shows a little bit more about that interaction. But these geese are pretty much ecosystem engineers in our system because they very much change the way the vegetation looks and how much of it exists on the landscape. So when there's a lot of them around, they convert this taller stature vegetation into this very short stature vegetation that you see there. And it's kind of funny because a lot of the geese biologists that have worked at our site for like 30 years thought that these were actually two different plant species for a really long time. And they have different scientific names even, but it's just the same plant species that the geese have so modified that they look really different. But now that we know that, maybe it doesn't make any sense that they thought that. So anyway, yeah, so they graze them, and once they graze it, it has really high % nitrogen, which is what they depend on. And there's like this positive feedback loop. The more grazing lawn, the more geese, the more geese, the more grazing lawn in the system. Okay. So are geese experiencing phenological mismatch? So as I said, there's 4 dominant geese at our site. We have black brant, cackling geese, emperor geese, and white-fronted geese. And they very closely follow each other in terms of hatch date, as you can see. And I'd like to say one thing here. So when the geese arrive is very, very highly correlated with when they have hatch. So these life history, the timing of these life history events are very linked. So you could look at hatch date, but you could also look at arrival date, and you kind of see the same patterns. But they have much better data on hatch than they do on arrival, so that's what I'm presenting here. So as you can see, over time at our site, they are arriving earlier. Over the last 30 years, we have data, and they're hatching earlier. And so they're arriving about 1.6 days per decade earlier over time. And then in that second slide, I showed you the green up dates at our site, so when spring is happening. And if we plot the hatch date versus the green up date, you see a couple things. One is that these things are highly correlated. So geese in general, if it's a really early spring year, they arrive earlier those years. If it's a really late spring year, they do arrive later those years. So they are tracking the start of spring pretty well. But the other thing I want you to notice is that the slope of this line is less than 1. And so the fact that it's less than 1 means that even though geese are coming earlier when there's earlier springs, they're not coming quite as early as they should. So we're seeing springs advance by about 2.6 days per decade. Geese aren't arriving quite that early. And so the mismatch that's developing is only about a day per decade. Could be significant over a long time period, but it's a minor kind of phenological mismatch that we see at our site developing. Okay, so our research questions were to look at how does the asynchrony between vegetation green up and migratory goose arrival influence a lot of variables in our system. And so we looked at a lot of different things, lots of different measured variables and hence papers looking at how asynchrony affects these things. So the first thing I'm going to present is the effect on forage quality. So we looked at forage quality because that's the main thing that people think is affected by phenological mismatch, so we wanted to look at that. And then we wanted to look at plant traits, like the lower trophic level, as I mentioned. And then I'm going to shift gears and talk about some ecosystem functioning variables. So we also looked at soil nitrogen availability and net ecosystem exchange and greenhouse gas flux. So I'm going to talk about them in that order. But all of these results came from the same experiment. So I'm going to explain the experimental design. So the experiment that we conducted was focused on advancing the growing season or changing the timing of the growing season and changing the timing of grazing. And so for the growing season, we just had ambient growing season conditions, and then we had advanced earlier springs, mostly because there's no scenario in which we think springs are actually going to go backwards. And then we changed the timing of grazing. So we looked at early goose arrival, typical or historic goose arrival, and late goose arrival, and also the possibility that geese stop coming to this site altogether because it's no longer really good habitat for them. So this is kind of more of a schematic of what we did, but we used a fully factorial design where we had both ambient growing season treatments as well as advanced growing season treatments. And then we had early grazing, typical or long-term kind of historic average grazing treatments, late and no grazing. And we also had a background control plot just to make sure that our grazing treatments were representing well what grazing is like on the landscape. So I call them grazing sometimes, and I call them arrival treatments sometimes, but as I mentioned, these things are highly linked. And we know that grazing is typically focused around hatch date, kind of like the main grazing happens right before hatch and then 40 days past hatch. So anyway, we had these treatments replicated 6 times across the landscape. We had 6 blocks. And the way that we advanced the growing season was we used open top chambers, so or OTCs, and we put these on the plots early season, not a long-term season warming treatment, but just early season to get the plants growing early, and then we removed the OTCs. And for the grazing treatments, we captured geese in very early season, late May, on nests, and we had a captive population of geese all summer that we kept and fed, and we introduced them to the plots to simulate these different grazing treatments. So how well did our treatments work? So we looked at vegetation height to see how well our advanced growing season treatment worked. And we ran, I forgot to say, we ran this experiment for 3 years. And we kept the same treatments on the same plots over those 3 years. So those plots experienced the same asynchrony treatment. So when we look across the 3 years and look at our vegetation height growth, we found that the advanced growing season treatment advanced stem height by about 3 weeks, all 3 years of our experiment. So this was kind of a 3-week advanced spring treatment. And that was very, very fortunate, very coincidental, because our grazing treatments were also offset by 3 weeks. So in some ways, we could really compare the advanced growing season versus the grazing treatment. In terms of their timing, their offset was the same. So we could compare them kind of more easily. So yeah, we used historic data to decide when the earliest goose arrivals kind of happened, and we ran those grazing treatments for 40 days because geese often forage for about 40 days near our site before they start moving inland to forage a little bit more and then fly south for the winter. And then this is the typical, which is based on like the long-term historic averages, and then also we used late arrival data to justify our late arrival treatment. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the forage quality results first. So those of you that care about geese only, this might be the most relevant to you. So just to review a little bit what this concept argues. So the phenological mismatch concept argues that geese usually arrive in time to maximize their exposure to high quality forage. And if with climate change we're seeing that seasons are advancing and the geese aren't arriving any earlier, that they might now be experiencing much lower quality forage than they would have historically, right? And so this is based on a lot of assumptions. One of those assumptions being that there's a decline in forage quality over the season. And people think this happens because they've measured that at a lot of sites. You expect plants to senesce and forage quality to decline. But I would argue that these ideas need to be tested. We need to know, what is the quality forage if the geese arrive early? What is the quality forage when they arrive late? And also, because our species in particular are known to really modify the vegetation that they use and actually increase forage quality when they start grazing, it could be that if they arrive early, they're able to maintain high quality forage because they're now grazing on it. And so we need to see, if that decline actually happens and how it plays out. As I mentioned, for our species, it's the percent nitrogen in the vegetation that's of most importance to them. So people have studied this for a long time in our system. And nitrogen is important because, really important for these guys, because what they're doing there requires a lot of energy and a lot of protein. First they arrive, they need to forage, they need to produce nests, then they need to rear their young. These small goslings have to grow large enough to be able to fly south. And the adults molt their feathers when they're up there, and they need to grow new feathers. So they're very limited by the amount of nitrogen, and people have done a lot of studies showing that if the forage is not very high in nitrogen, then the goslings don't grow as large. And there's actually lower recruitment the next year. So this is important. So that's what we looked at in our study. We looked at the percent nitrogen in the foliage, and also we looked at CN ratios. But, okay, let me just summarize what we found here. So this is the first, second, and third year of the experiment. This is the advanced growing season treatment and the ambient season treatment. And then this is when we had early grazing, typical, and late grazing. This is the early grazing treatment response, typical, late, and no grazing. Okay, so what did we find? We found a bunch of cool things. First thing we found was that season advancement didn't influence the peak timing or season-long percent nitrogen. So this is kind of huge because, like I showed you in those figures, like we kind of expect that there's a peak nitrogen that would shift earlier in the growing season, and we didn't find that at all. I mean, you can see that there's really no difference between our advanced and ambient growing season in terms of when the peak nitrogen happens. And so that's kind of important because that's one of the huge assumptions that people use to assume that phenological mismatch is going to impact these species. But we did see that early season grazing increases the percent nitrogen by 17% over the whole growing season. So you can see that pretty clearly here. Like in the early grazing treatments, they have just much higher percent nitrogen, throughout the season compared to the other treatments. The no grazing and the no grazing treatments had much lower nitrogen throughout the season, percent nitrogen available, so by 15 or 26%. And you can see that they also had that decline in forage quality over time. So even though the geese started grazing, like here you can see it, they started grazing late in that season and they were able to increase their forage quality a little bit, but overall, the available percent nitrogen is just much lower throughout the season, and they could never increase it with that grazing up to what it would have been had they started grazing earlier. And we had similar patterns for carbon nitrogen ratios in the foliage. So the other thing is that early grazing didn't interact significantly with the day of year. So percent nitrogen was high when they got there, so it's always high early season for all the treatments, but then it remained high throughout the season and didn't experience that decline that you might expect it to experience. So our conclusions from this paper were that, first, the timing of goose arrival is much more important than when the season starts. And so what we really need to be looking at in terms of whether these geese are going to be impacted by forage quality is when they're leaving their wintering ground. That's like the most important variable. And what's happening in terms of spraying up at these sites is not as important. And a lot of times people have just used NDVI measurements as a surrogate for forage quality. So they've just looked at when does green up start, and then they say, oh, well then, forage quality has been shifted because green ups started. We argue that you can't really use that as a surrogate for forage quality. You really need to go out on the ground and measure whether or not there's been a change in forage quality with those earlier springs. We also found that late arriving geese experience low quality forage when they arrive, and they're never able to kind of increase the quality of forage to what it should have been. Early arriving geese fare best because they experience relatively high quality forage when they get there and throughout the whole time that they're there foraging. And the percent change in nitrogen that we measured between our early and late arriving geese has been shown experimentally by Jim Sedinger's group and others to be significant enough to impact gosling size significantly enough that it could influence population recruitment. So really when they arrive is what's going to matter for these populations. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears and talk about the potential impacts to the lower trophic level. So what's happening to the forage species with these different treatments. And I'm also going to measure the soil nitrogen response a little bit. So I only have one slide here that describes all of the plant trait responses. So there's a lot going on here, but it's just easier to show it in one slide. So here it is. So these are the timing of grazing treatments: early, late, and no grazing. Everything's compared to typical grazing, which is why it's not here. And then this is the timing of season treatment. So a few things. The red arrows are negative relationships. The blue arrows are positive relationships. And the dashed lines represent variables that didn't show this response the first year of the experiment, but did by the third year. And I'll explain that as I go. But in general, when there was early grazing, we saw that early grazing reduces above ground biomass. It reduces stem height. It reduces the number of tillers produced by plants, and it reduces root biomass. So when the geese get there early, there's just basically less vegetation in the system. So it kind of looks more like this. It's kind of like the early grazing treatment. When they arrive late, we see that there's more standing dead biomass by the third year of the experiment in the system. And these plants start shifting from being clonally reproducing to producing flowers. And I don't know if you remember those grazing lawn pictures I showed early on, but usually grazing lawn has no standing dead in it. There's no like leaf litter in the system. There's no like dried out dead biomass from the year before. And these plants don't produce flowers. They don't get tall enough to start like producing flowers that you might see in like sedges or grasses. So we only see that happen when geese don't graze it. And so with the late grazing treatment, by the third year, these had shifted to being really kind of a different system with more standing dead, more shading, and flowering. So shifting to sexual reproduction, which is kind of interesting for the plants. And then with no grazing at all, we saw lots of responses: much greater above ground biomass, greater stem height, more standing dead. We saw by the third year that there was less tillers and less root biomass. This response was kind of interesting because in the first year of the experiment with no grazing, we saw positive effects on tillers and on root biomass. But by the third year, these plots had so much interspecific competition for resources happening that the plants actually started negatively responding to the no grazing treatment. And we also saw, greater inflorescence when there was no grazing. So it looked more like this, right? And then with season advancement, we saw greater stem height, greater standing dead, and by the third year, those treatments were also producing inflorescence. Okay, so that's kind of important and interesting. And then my PhD student's still writing up this data, but I wanted to present it because it's an ecosystem response that I think is kind of interesting and relevant. But he's doing a paper looking at soil nitrogen responses to these treatments. And we had resins out there, and we had lysimeters, and so we know what was happening a little bit in the soil. And we found that with the early grazing treatments, there's just a lot more nitrogen in the soil sitting around. So a lot more ammonium, a lot more amino acids, and nitrate, all significant. And I would argue that this is mainly happening just because there's so much less biomass that the plants just aren't taking up that nitrogen resource. So it's just still hanging out here. And also with early grazing, you might expect that they're creating a nitrogen source with their fecal matter. With late grazing and the advanced growing season treatment, there was a lot less nitrogen in the system. And that makes sense because both of these treatments had a lot more biomass. Okay. So just to summarize the plant trait responses, the advanced growing season treatment and the late grazing treatment had similar directional effects on the plant traits. So they both increased stem height, increased inflorescence, increased standing dead in the system. So just kind of more biomass in general. But grazing influenced these variables much more than the advanced growing season did. They had impacts that were 3 to 5 times greater than the advanced growing season treatment. So again, I would argue that if we're concerned about how the plants are going to respond to these asynchronies in our system, it's really the timing of goose arrival that's going to be the most important variable there. And the other thing that's interesting is that because we ran this for 3 years, not all of our variables responded to these treatments in the first year, and some of our variables, like tillers and root biomass, even changed the direction of the response to these treatments by the 3rd year. And so this kind of argues that we might not be able to just do these experiments short term, but if we really want to know what's going to happen to these systems longer term, we have to maybe do long-term experiments or measure these things on the landscape for a long period of time where we're seeing consistent directional responses. Okay, and now the exciting stuff you've all been waiting for. What is the net ecosystem exchange response or the greenhouse gas response to these treatments? I know a lot of you are interested in this. So these are the systems that we used. We had 2 ways to measure carbon flux. We had a portable, discrete measurement. So the portable was like a Lycor. And so we dragged this around to 5 of our 6 blocks twice a week and took measurements in all of our treatments. These are kind of instantaneous measurements, but we had replication because we had 5 blocks, so that's good. Our other approach was to use this commercial system where you can't drag it around on the landscape, but we set it up just on 1 of our 6 blocks. But it was taking measurements every hour in every treatment for the 3 years that we ran this experiment during the growing season. So no replication because it was just on 1 block, but it also has these like hourly measurements, 24 hours a day. So we wanted to see how these 2 systems kind of compared too in terms of what they told us. So these are our results. So net ecosystem exchange is over here. These are our treatments. So this is net carbon gain or uptake, and this is carbon loss from the system. And I'm going to present the results from our discrete Lycor system first. So this showed that with late grazing, we had greater carbon uptake in our treatments by about 118 grams per meter squared. And with our early season treatments, we had reduced carbon uptake by about 125 grams per meter squared. And so those might make sense, knowing what our biomass responses were. The advanced growing season treatment was actually a little interesting, maybe didn't show exactly what we thought we might see. So with the advanced growing season, we actually saw a reduction, very small reduction in uptake by about 16 grams per meter squared. And since we know these treatments have a little bit more biomass, that's maybe interesting why that happened. When we take these results over the 3 years of our experiment and model them out, this is what we found. And so this is ecosystem respiration, this is net ecosystem exchange, and this is gross primary productivity. And so what you can see pretty clearly here is that with the advanced growing season treatment, the reason that we had that reduced uptake is that we had very slightly greater ecosystem respiration in those treatments. Kind of makes sense because if you warm the system a little bit, you might have more ecosystem respiration. But it didn't result really in a significant NEE change with those treatments. And then there's a few other interesting things to note here. So these gray panels show you when the grazing was actually happening. So this is early grazing, typical grazing, and late grazing. And what you can see here is that with the early grazing treatment, if they start grazing very early in the system, late spring, early summer, the system, instead of being a sink of carbon, actually becomes a very slight source of carbon to the atmosphere. So with this treatment, you can actually shift the system from being a carbon sink to being a carbon source. And you can see that, these kind of very much fit with when the grazing happens. You start seeing a reduction in uptake. Okay, and what about the continuous system that was only on that one block that was taking the hourly measurements? So we found with that system that with late grazing, we have a much greater uptake of carbon by 270 grams per meter squared with late grazing compared to typical grazing. What's kind of interesting is that the early grazing we would have expected would have shifted up here, but in this one block, maybe because we just didn't have replication, we didn't see that finding of a reduction in CO2 uptake. But we did see the same thing with the advanced growing season that we saw with the discrete measurements, that with the advanced growing season treatments, we saw very small increases in CO2 uptake by about 25 grams per meter squared. So, in summary, the discrete and continuous measurements in general agreed, which was pretty good. The advanced growing season treatment only barely increased ecosystem respiration, which reduced carbon uptake, but had no real measurable change on NEE. The late grazing treatment resulted in greater primary productivity and greater NEE. The early grazing treatment had lower NEE with potential net carbon loss late spring and early summer when it converts from being a sink of carbon to a source. And we argue that the timing of grazing could have a significant impact on carbon balance in this northern coastal wetland, because if geese keep coming earlier, it could really have like an impact in creating a kind of a source ecosystem. We also had a Picaro out there that was measuring greenhouse gas emissions. This was done in the third year of the experiment, and we measured CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions twice a week in 5 of our 6 blocks. And these are the results from the Picaro. So I'm not going to go too much over the CO2 flux results because they're very similar to what I just presented, but they collaborate those results in that, the early grazing treatment became more of a source of carbon than a sink. As far as methane, kind of showed the opposite pattern of CO2. So we saw much more methane being emitted from the late and no grazing treatments. And in general, nitrous oxide was pretty negligible from our system, but we did see a slight increase in nitrous oxide emissions with the early grazing treatments. So this is a little bit like comparing apples and oranges because we know that methane and nitrous oxide are worse greenhouse gas molecules. So we converted them to CO2 equivalents so that we could compare them and to make kind of a summary of what's the greenhouse gas emissions from these treatments, and that's what these are showing. And so, so this from that paper is showing that with advanced growing season, we have a little bit less CO2 uptake and less methane and less nitrous, or about the same nitrous oxide emission with the advanced growing season. And with the ambient growing season, we have much more CO2 uptake, but we also have greater methane emission. But in general, if you put this together, the advanced growing season treatment is worse from a greenhouse gas perspective. And then if we look at timing of grazing, it's really that, again, that early grazing season treatment that's an overall emitter of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And so it's the worst in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the later or no grazing treatments are better from a greenhouse gas emission perspective, even though there's more methane released from those treatments. Okay, so in summary, the advanced growing season decreased CO2 uptake and decreases methane. Overall has a small negative effect on greenhouse gas flux, but the effect is small compared to the grazing treatments. Early and late grazing have kind of opposite effects on greenhouse gas flux. The early grazing increases CO2 emissions, and decreases methane emissions. The late grazing increases CO2 uptake and increases methane emissions. But overall, if none of that makes sense to you, overall, the late geese, the later they arrive, the better from a greenhouse gas perspective. But unfortunately, in our system, as I mentioned earlier, the geese, even though we predict with climate change that geese are supposed to arrive functionally later than they have historically, in our system, they're arriving earlier over time, right? So if they keep arriving earlier, this could have long-term sink strength consequences for our ecosystem. So what is the goose going to do, since we know this is really what matters? So they're coming all the way from Baja California, and you know, they have a couple options, right? So, I mean, they can keep coming earlier and keep trying to track those earlier springs. They could maybe not migrate down as far every year to be able to do that better. There are some that don't fly all the way to Baja California. Or over time, they might just say, hey, you know, the north slope of Alaska also has Carrick subspathicea, and that's a nice habitat for us, so we're just going to start going up there. Some people have written papers about that and argue that that's kind of what Brant are starting to do. We have also seen over the last 100 years declines in general of Brant at our site. So that might be the future for them. But I'm going to put all this together in a summary slide. And so what does the future hold? This, I'm saying, is the current condition. So this is the ambient growing season treatment with earlier goose arrival, because the geese are arriving earlier every year. And if that's what we have and what's going to kind of continue to happen, then we're going to have less biomass in the system, but we're going to have higher forage quality. So the geese are going to continue to be pretty happy at this site. There's going to be a lot more nitrogen available in the soil. And I didn't get too much into this, but our site, as I said, is very close to the Bering Sea. It's very tidally influenced. Floods happen all the time. This site is underwater through a lot of the fall. So with a lot of nitrogen in the system and with the high tides coming in every month, this nitrogen could be just leached out. Having high nitrogen around could also influence the long-term plant community dynamics. We don't know. There could be plants that are going to do better if there's just a lot more nitrogen around. But maybe more importantly, from a greenhouse gas emission perspective, there's going to be a lot more greenhouse gas emitted from this system if the geese keep arriving earlier. So the geese are happy. They got high quality forage. But from an ecosystem perspective, it's not a good situation. This is not the situation that maybe we want. If the geese, stop coming or start arriving late, there's going to be a lot more biomass in the system, a lot less nitrogen available. The forage quality is going to go down, so the geese aren't going to be very happy when they get there. And from a greenhouse gas emission perspective, we're going to see a lot less greenhouse gas is emitted. So it's interesting because this future perspective is worse for the geese, but it's kind of better from an ecosystem perspective. So I would argue that it's really worth watching these long-distance migrations, not just from an herbivore perspective, because that's really how we've just been looking at it, like what's going to happen to the geese, what's their forage quality look like. If we take into account other things like nitrogen cycling and carbon cycling, maybe we're not as depressed about this future climate scenario. Okay, so what are some future directions for research? There's been lots of calls for people to look at the ecosystem consequences of changing phenologies, but really no studies done other than the one that we've done that I know of. So I would argue that we need to look at this a lot more. We need to look at the ecosystem consequences of changing phenology. Most of these studies are only looking at simple two-species interactions. We're guilty of that as well. We only looked at black brant and Carrick subspathicea. These studies need to start looking at whole community level changes and changing phenologies and the subsequent interactions among species because of all of that. And then we need to integrate these complex community changes with ecosystem consequences to be able to get a real handle of how these systems are going to change into the future. And with that, I'm just going to thank my funders and our field crew and open it up to any questions you might have. Thanks.